Hello, and welcome to the series Conversation on International Development. Today, I'm delighted to say our guest is Professor Aart Scholte. Professor Scholte is a professor at the University of Leiden, to which he has moved only recently, and he's also the co-director of the Center for Global Cooperation Studies, University of Duisburg-Essen, Germany. Before that, Professor Scholte was at the University of Gothenburg, and before that still, he was at Warwick and was the director of the Center for the Study of Globalization and Regionalization, which is still continuing. His book, Globalizations, which he wrote whilst at Warwick, is now a classic on the topic and is on your reading list. Welcome, Aart.
Okay, thank you, Shirin.
Today, I would like to revisit some of your work in the context of our new realities. So my first question is that at the start of the millennium, you defined globalization through 5 key concepts: internationalization, liberalization, universalisation, westernization, and deterritorialization. You were also, if I remember right, largely optimistic about globalization. Since the book was published first, the world has changed dramatically. Are you optimistic about globalization today?
Okay, thanks. There's a couple of parts to that question. Maybe I should say that when I wrote this book, you're right to place it in a historical moment. First edition was 2000. It was written mainly between 1995 and 2000. And then the second edition came out in 2005. So really, we're talking 15 to 20 years now. When I spent so much time in that book, the second chapter of that book, defining the concept of global and globalization, it was because the term at that time was being thrown around a lot without being very careful about what it might mean. And so this internationalization, liberalization, universalization, westernization, deterritorialization, that typology of definitions was, I think, helpful at that time to let people distinguish what kind of globalization they had in their head. Today, I hope that conceptual distinction isn't as important, that people have a better handle on what they mean by global and globalization, but maybe insofar as the book still seems to be used, in spite of being rather dated in its empirical content, maybe that says that people still need to get the concept sorted out in their heads. Okay, on the optimism, the book had the subtitle A Critical Introduction, which meant that the globalization that I was seeing in the 1990s, turn of the millennium, was to me not a very happy globalization in a lot of ways. It was a globalization of a lot of economic austerity, a lot of top-down global governance interventions in many parts of the world, particularly in the global south, severe questions about democracy, justice in the global order of the time. So it was a critical introduction. The optimism related to the fact that at the turn of the millennium, there was a lot of mobilization that was excited about alter globalization. It wasn't necessarily anti-globalization, but alternative globalization. A lot of visions about how a process of globalizing social relations could move into more positive, constructive, progressive directions. And there were a lot of activities around the so-called World Social Forum. There were a lot of mobilizations against the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, which had a number of impacts at the time. Global corporations were pushed to adopt corporate social responsibility agendas. And there was a lot of areas where you thought, well, if this is the beginning of something bigger, then maybe we could move in a direction to get maybe something like a global social democratic kind of order. So maybe we could move beyond liberalism and conservative reactions against liberalism to something different, as one had seen in the nation state. in the earlier 20th century. You know, the people broke through this opposition of liberalism and conservatism and got to the welfare state and social democracy. Okay, we can argue about how well that heritage is held up in recent times, but in my optimism, as you call it, I thought maybe that one could move to a more democratic, a more just, equitable, a more ecologically sound global order. Okay, now we're indeed 15 to 20 years later, and it doesn't look very happy in that regard. Instead of a movement from a liberal to a kind of social market and then maybe on to a social democratic globalization, instead what we've had is a veritable anti-globalization, a veritable movement away from global connectivity, or at least in politics, people emphasizing the ecological, cultural, political, economic harms as they see it of global connectivity, and seeing that the answer to that is, or seeing that those harms are intrinsic to global connectivity, and saying that therefore the answer is to retreat to territorial spaces, closed borders, inward-looking, communitarian kind of politics. And that expresses itself across the world in so many nation states, whether it's Putin's Russia or Trump's United States or Modi's India or Duterte's Philippines, Bolsonaro's Brazil. I mean, across the planet, we've seen a lot of turns in this so-called anti-globalist sort of direction. And that has gone hand in hand with a decline in intergovernmental multilateralism. We might talk about that in more detail a little bit later, but certainly I had thought at the turn of the millennium that we might be in a Polanyian double movement on global scale, that we were not going to have that the reaction to neoliberalism would not be mercantilism and protectionism, but would be a more socially sound, ecologically sound, okay, capitalism, but at least a capitalism with some social conscience and ecological ethics. Okay, so there we are. We didn't quite go to that station. Maybe the second Polanyi's double movement is going to take a little bit longer than I anticipated. Let's be optimistic.
I hope so, because without that, I think it would be very difficult to live through this pandemic much more than anything else. So I think building on what you have just said, actually, one of the things that is, I remember sort of having these conversations with you. One of the key concepts amongst those 5 that you sort of, put forward was deterritorialization. And as you have just now said, that kind of move back to a particular kind of nationalism, it's kind of with us now. And in that sort of, I was reading your latest, not the latest, but the piece that you shared with us, which the students have also read, that in this thinking about globalization, you suggest that global theory still struggles to move from universalist to transculturalist dispositions. What do you mean by this, and how do you think this can be achieved?
Yeah. I think one of the objections to the neoliberal and general liberal globalization is its globalism. And by globalism here, I mean an idea that that globalization means the transmission of one societal model and one way of thinking about development to a global scale. And that a lot of the reactions, the anti-globalization reactions, are often reactions against that universalism. So you saw that universalism in many manifestations, whether it's the International Monetary Fund and World Bank having certain kinds of structural adjustment formulas that they took to all parts of the global South and indeed the former East in the 1980s and 1990s, and to some extent to this day also. One model, so globalization means bringing one kind of political economy to all corners of the planet, to all humanity, and there's going to be one way. So globalization means assimilationism. It means putting the whole global society in one model. And then you have indeed a globalization which is culturally violent, and which imposes across the planet one way, generally a Eurocentric way of saying there's one path of development, a certain part of the world is ahead of the rest of the world, and globalization means getting the rest of the world to catch up with the model. And understandably, lots of people have resisted that. What you often have then is a loosely called communitarian resistance to that liberal universalist cosmopolitanism, a West-centric cosmopolitanism, if you like, which kind of assumes that cosmopolitanism means Western-led assimilationism, and the way to resist that is to emphasize the local, to emphasize the national, to emphasize the difference, and to emphasize cutting off and bordering and boundary work and limit the engagement with the global in order to preserve community, to preserve values, to preserve the good society in an inward kind of looking way. So that's a politics that would be my reading of multiculturalism. One can think about, transculturalism is probably a take that some people would have on the concept of multiculturalism. But for me, the concept of multiculturalism very often means multi-cultures, with the suggestion that you separate those cultures into their own segregated spaces, and maybe they have some interrelations or some exchanges in order to, exchange necessary economic resources or something, but there's no full engagement and full conversation or looking for cultural change and transformation in the process of conversation. But so I would link that kind of thinking of multiculturalism with communitarianism, separation, inward-looking, limited contact. It's almost like multidisciplinarity as opposed to interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. You have the economists, political scientists, anthropologists who say, well, we'll all be in a faculty of social science, and we'll maybe have lunch in the same canteen, and occasionally we'll talk with each other, but we're never going to publish together. We're never going to really work together, and we tolerate each other. And that, to me, is kind of the multicultural idea transposed to wider global society. So, the Russians will be over here and they're self-defined, and the self-defined Europeans will be over there, and they'll sort of say, okay, yeah, well, occasionally we'll have a visa and we'll visit each other and we'll say, isn't this an interesting place? And yes, but for the rest, no real engagement. And there are others, though, who are more enthusiastic about encounters of diversity and difference, and I would call them intercultural. So I'm getting to the transcultural alternative eventually, but for the intercultural, I would say, and you see this, the type of people say, oh, it's wonderful to encounter difference. It's so exciting. Let's go to a different restaurant every night of the week for a different cuisine. Let's travel to another country every summer or every holiday in order to experience the other. And let's have exchange students, and it's all wonderful to be in touch with diversity and difference. It enriches our lives, and this is all fine, and I'm very sympathetic to it and all, but it's an approach to cultural diversity and difference which ignores questions of power in general. And also, it doesn't ask, well, what are the power relations that are connected with these cultural diversities and difference? So which knowledges actually kind of have it for the saying, and which are in general more marginalized, more silent, and so not every restaurant is equal, let's put it that way. And so what's going on there? And very often the intercultural sort of celebration comes from people in positions of considerable culture, knowledge, power, who are a little bit blind to the advantages that they have in the global politics knowledge. So, and also this approach skirts the question of irreconcilable differences, in the unpalatable differences. I mean, there come times when difference is problematic. There come times when difference is about whether you accept a gun culture or not, whether you accept gender violence or not. I mean, there are lots of times when culture, quote unquote, is connected with practices that are, putting it mildly, problematic. And you can't at that point simply say, oh, but I really like your menu at the restaurant. You have to say, no, there's something that is extremely difficult here. So this is where I would want to part from the intercultural and move towards the transcultural and say we need to have some hard cultural politics that confront these questions of deep incompatibilities and deal with them in an alternative way. Because the universalist, liberalist, modernist, westernist approach to such problems is to say, well, you're just going to have to grow up and develop and become like us. And then it'll be fine, because then you won't have female genital mutilation, and you won't have, well, for some reason there seem to be death penalties and large gun cultures in certain parts of the world that claim to be at the head of history. But okay, well, let's leave that to one side. But I mean, but the notion is somehow that you'll take care of these these problems by labeling them as primitive and people to culturally grow up. Well, this doesn't really work in the actual cultural engagement and conversations and what end up being conflicts. The multiculturalist sort of approach then says, well, to each their own. Just leave everyone in their particular neighborhoods and let them have their own life worlds and so on and so forth. But this is then saying, okay, stand by while there are major, what you consider to be major violences. And I think a lot of people say, well, that's also not acceptable. Just because someone is in a different cultural space or on the other side of a territorial border doesn't mean that you then say it's absolutely fine that there is huge inequalities or starvations or whatever other objectionable conditions and behaviors there might be. So that then led me to say, well, what do we do instead? And a number of philosophers of diversity and difference have put forward this concept of transculturalism. I thought I had made it up, but then of course you do a Google and as usual find out that you're the last one on the block to have thought of it. But doesn't matter. The point is to say, here is an idea that you approach cultural diversity and difference, knowledge diversities and differences in world politics, global politics, with a care and a perhaps higher level of self and critical self-consciousness, which enables an engagement with diversity and difference, challenging and more difficult, but perhaps in the long run more constructive. And here, what I have in mind is that in the encounter with diversity and difference, all parties have a very high sensitivity, a very high reflexivity, a very high self-awareness of where they are situated in value and knowledge terms. That they are searching in themselves, and again, this requires all parties to do the same. And to be very sensitively aware of their positionality, if you like. Part of that positionality also is to be highly conscious of the politics of the position, and to be very aware that part of the situatedness of people is the power relations of their encounter, and that a self-consciousness of those power relations, that at least for the moment of the encounter of diversity and difference, you have a keen awareness of that, and you try to put those power hierarchies, be aware of them, but don't exercise them, and try to put them to one side for the moment of the conversation. Very difficult to do, but nevertheless, and then start from a position of encouraging, being curious about, being interested in, and to use the cliche term, celebrate the diversity and difference. So have a starting point that says, let's be interested, positive, and engaging with the diversity and difference. Wait for it to be problematic. Don't start from the position that is problematic, but go as far as you can until you encounter the moment where it becomes problematic. But don't immediately go to the point of irreconcilable difference. Look for all of the complementaries, look for all of the curiosities, look for all of the areas for mutual enhancement and interest. Yes, at some point you are almost invariably going to encounter those issues, those value conflicts, which really go down to primary positions and core values. And this is where it becomes hard. But again, instead of reacting by immediately hopping on a moral high horse and saying, well, I'm on the right side and you're on the wrong side, a bit of humility can help. A bit of humility in realizing that every position is limited by its historical, social, cultural location, and so is your so-called superior position. So yes, you may still feel that your position in this encounter is morally advantaged, but advantaged with a small a. And it's good to remember that in various other historical moments and so on, your so-called superior position has actually looked pretty awful. So you might have your moment of Western supremacism, but that Western supremacism was the slave trade at another moment, and various others. So that kind of humility in the face of these difficult positions is one thing, and then from that position of a as I say, real humility, and a genuine humility, not just an act, but a genuine humility. If you then move into a discussion of difference, again, differences that might be very difficult to swallow in many cases. But if you enter that encounter then with an intention of, if I can call it, deep listening, and deep listening means really listening. I don't know if you do you probably do the same thing as me. A lot of times when you're listening, you're kind of superficially listening, and you're mostly thinking about what you are thinking about in reaction to it, rather than really listening to what the other person is saying, or you're thinking more about what you're going to say, what your response is going to be, as opposed to really hearing out what the other person is saying. So a deep listening means, as I say, really listening to what a person, explains about their love of guns or whatever, a position that you find extremely difficult. And if that deep listening leads to some greater understanding of where someone is coming from, even if it's not necessarily leading to a respect, it sets up, and if both parties are coming at it in this way, then the chances of some mutual communication, some deeper communication, and some mutual learning, which might lead to some mutual change, is opened up. I'm sorry, this is a very long answer, but I think it's not something that you can just rattle off with a. But in what ethic for difference for dealing with diversity and especially difference in global politics, as I say, rests on that careful reflexivity, a deep acknowledgement of power relations, an eagerness and a curiosity about diversity and difference to begin with, a humility when encountering the problematic clashes, a deep listening and mutual deep listening in dealing with those differences, and through that, hopefully, mutual learning and mutual change. But again, mutual change, it means that you change as well as the other.
Wow. So I think the agenda for change that you have mapped out there is very difficult, but you were not promising anything easy anyway. But I also hear you, listening to you. I also feel, and I really appreciate that point about listening, Janat, because I think that almost all democratic theorists need to hear that and listen to that, because we are also to focusing on quote unquote giving voice rather than what I call in my work practices of listening, which is exactly what you have underlined here. And I think that we have, as theorists working in these areas of democracy, democratization, globalization, intercultural, transcultural communication, we need to understand that. So I get that. The problem, of course, as you know, better than most, that it translates, which is big enough a problem, from an interpersonal cultural exchange to institutional and policy frameworks reflecting that change. So that brings me to the final question that I have for you, which is that you have seen recently attacks upon the WHO, the UN came out. I mean, the UN just now, let's not just even talk about Trump, but given what he has done, attack on the WHO and UN more generally, do you think that part of that problem is, of course, Trump's politics and the kind of response to globalization and globalism that you were talking about earlier? Do you think international institutions that we have today have a future, or do we need a different global institutional architecture to address our global problems today? Because I think that we seem to be at that juncture just now where these are the Bretton Woods organizations were part of a different politics also. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to link, because you said some really interesting things there about democracy and democratic theory, and maybe that is also a specific example of some of these alternative ways of dealing with diversity and difference, and a really crucial one. Because when people talk about democracy and bringing democracy to global politics, you do have the universalist tendency, which says there is a model of democracy developed in the West, and that is going to be the model for democracy across the planet, both within countries all over the planet and also in global relations. So democracy for global governance and global government, if it were ever to happen, is going to follow that kind of notion of democracy. And that's that kind of assimilationist view that says, we've got one set of values and we're going to take it everywhere. And I worry that so much democratic theory brought into global politics is based on that kind of premise. A lot of well-intentioned, excellent thinkers, but who can't get beyond an idea that democracy is this liberal, Western, modern way of bringing people's power into politics. And if you think about democracy as a situation where affected people have due opportunities to participate and control the decisions that shape their collective life. If you have a more generic notion of what democracy is about, and then you go into global politics and say, what are the various diverse and different ways that people can put that principle into practice, and then have a transcultural discussion about what the shared democratic framework might be in global politics, that would be so different than a democracy that says, let's go to Oxford and Cambridge and hear what the political theorists there have to say about democracy, and then ship it off to Mongolia and wait for the, anyway, sorry, I digress slightly, but it's such an important point, the democracy in relation to that earlier point about transculturalism. All the moment of 75 years of the United Nations system, the San Francisco Charter was drafted and signed, ratified 75 years ago. The United Nations opened its doors in October 1945. At that time, the vision was that the United Nations was global governance. They didn't use the phrase global governance at the time, but that this was, and some people even thought this is the seed, this is the beginnings of a world government, even a world federalism. As though then the United Nations would grow and expand over the ensuing decades and become more and more developed, and eventually even maybe transition into something of a world state. 75 years later, this is clearly not happening. The core staff of the United Nations is smaller than the New York Fire Department payroll. So if the United Nations is supposed to be fighting fires across the planet, it has fewer firefighters than the New York City. And the core budget of the United Nations is smaller than the budget of the city of Stockholm. So for all that the United Nations might embody values that many people might embrace, for all that it may set itself behind principles that many people value, for all that the United Nations has been important, one should say, in advancing a number of key principles, sustainable development, gender equity, a lot of core concepts in what many people would regard as progressive global politics have had their incubator in the United Nations. And that's often forgotten. People are often looking at the failures of the peacekeeping troops here or the lack of funds for economic development projects there. But in the sort of intellectual, the development of ideas of global politics, the United Nations has been really, really quite important. But as said, when you look at it as an overall global governance system relative to the challenges that we see, it's not up to the task. And we see that with the World Health Organization, the health arm, if you like, of the United Nations system. A budget of about $4 billion per year before the US withdraws its contribution. And look at how we are dealing with this global pandemic. How often are you listening to the WHO? How much lead is the WHO taking in terms of gathering and policy development, in terms of development, in terms of planning for the post-pandemic rehabilitation and reconstruction? The WHO is a bit player. It's a sadly perhaps, but these are the realities. The multilateral global governance is weak, and over recent decades it has declined. So the rate of expansion of these institutions has declined. The number of new multilateral treaties and institutions has declined. So to say global governance and the future of global governance lies in multilateral institutions like the United Nations, I think it's dangerous to put all your eggs into the multilateral basket. There are other institutional designs of global governance that are expanding while multilateralism is relatively and sometimes absolutely contracting. These include transgovernmental networks. That means informal collaborations amongst governments. A prominent example is the G20, the Group of 20. The G7, the Group of 7, is another prominent example. In the current pandemic, the collaborations amongst centers of disease control and collaborations amongst ministries of health are transgovernmental collaborations, which is where a lot more action is than the World Health Organization. So the shortcomings of the United Nations system, there are functional needs for global cooperation of various kinds. And if the multilateral system doesn't deliver, people are going to other institutional forms. Transgovernmental forms are one. Another is I'll call it translocal connections, where sub-state, provinces, municipalities develop their own global networks separately from states. And I would love, for example, to look at the intercity, intermetropolitan connections that might have been ongoing behind the scenes in the current pandemic. I have a hunch, I haven't done the research, but I have a hunch that if one looked, one would find that London was having a lot of interchanges with New York and Paris and Moscow and Wuhan and etc. That a lot of things are happening between cities and provinces, and that there's a multilateralism of, not the United Nations, but United Cities. Indeed, there is a body called United Cities and Local Government. So the city connection. Then there's a lot of private global governance. You see a lot of it in the area of internet governance, in the area of a number of environmental things, corporate social responsibility regimes mentioned earlier on, in financial markets, a lot of private global governance. So industry-led, business-led rules, standards, regulations, because rules and standards and collaborations are required to make these often very important parts of global capitalism work. So a lot of business takes this in hand itself. So that's a big growth area. And then these so-called multi-stakeholder arrangements, where people from different sectors that are involved in a particular issue get together and make rules. A lot of the rules around fair trade, a lot of the rules around, again, internet areas, also a number of environmental areas, they are made through global multi-stakeholder forums these days, not through multilateral forums. Anyway, again, another long answer, but to say there are multiple kinds of global governance unfolding at the moment. And it's really important not to limit global governance to multilateral institutions, but to recognize that, in fact, in general, multilateral institutions are relatively on the decline. It's not on the decline, it's on the rise, once you look at all these other forms. The big problem is that if you look at these other forms, you have to ask very hard questions about power, very hard questions about democracy, very much hard questions about accountability, about legitimacy. And while we don't ask those questions, these new types of global governance evolve and become more powerful and do things to our lives that perhaps we might not want.
Thank you, Jan-Aart. I think, it's such a complex world we are living in now. When I look back to the publication of Globalizations, and indeed my own work on globalization at that time and where we are today, I think it's not just the pandemic, but all that has happened between that period and now. But as you have just outlined so clearly to us, that there are other sort of modes of being, transculturalism, and modes of governance that we need to keep our eye on. So thank you very, very much for giving us this time. And I'm sure the students will have lots of questions and we'll have a wonderful discussion about your work. Thanks.
Okay, no, thanks very much for the opportunity and the talk. Nice to see you again.